What's up, guys? Today we are on the 28th shelf of my wrestling collection. These are all TNA wrestling videos. I haven't watched a whole lot of them, just some of them. This is one I have not watched, The History of TNA Year 1. I was big into wrestling, and this came out in, what year was this? 2007. So I was starting to try to collect these so I could check them out and see how good, if they're any good or whatnot. I just never got around to really watching a lot of these, but hoping this is good. If you've seen any TNA documentaries, let me know if documentaries or pay-per-views, let me know if they're any good. Comment down below. And we have Final Resolution 2005. I did watch this one. This one was an okay pay-per-view. We got Primetime Elix Skipper versus Sanjay Dutt. Elix Skipper was in WCW before it shut down. You got the 3 Live Crew versus the Fallen Angel, Christopher Daniels, Matt Bentley, and Kazarian. I know Christopher Daniels and Kazarian are good wrestlers. Dustin Rhodes versus Kid Cash. Raven versus Eric Watts. Boy, Eric Watts was here. Look at that. Jeff Hardy versus Scott Hall was not good. And you got Team Canada and America's Most Wanted. You got P.D. Williams versus the phenomenal AJ Styles versus Chris Sabin. Then you got Diamond Dallas Page versus Kevin Nash versus the alpha male Monty Brown. And then the winner faces Jeff Jarrett for the title. So all in all, this was an okay pay-per-view. It felt small because they're just doing it out of the Impact Center, but that was one of TNA's downfalls anyway. Then we have Bound for Glory 2005, which is pretty much their WrestleMania. It just seems like they were just trying to get everyone on this card because there's so many multiple person matches here. Diamonds in the Rough versus Sony Sakai, Apollo, and Shark Boy. Then you got the X Division 4-Way. The original player from Himalaya, Sanjay Dutt versus Alex Shelley, Austin Aries, and Roderick Strong. A lot of those guys were in WWE recently. 3 Live Crew versus Team Canada. The alpha male Monty Brown versus Lance Hoyt. Then you got Monsters Ball. You got Abyss versus Rhino versus Sabu versus Jeff Hardy. International Showdown, Samoa Joe versus Jushin Thunder Liger. Jushin Thunder Liger was kind of past his prime at this point, so it wasn't a great match. Got America's Most Wanted versus the Naturals. Then you got Matt Bentley versus Chris Sabin. AJ Styles versus Christopher Daniels, which is an amazing match. They always had great matches together. Then the gauntlet to determine the #1 contender. You got Abyss versus Rhino versus Monty Brown versus AJ Styles versus Ron Killings versus Kip James, which is Billy Gunn. Samoa Joe, Lance Hoyt, Sabu, Jeff Hardy. And then it's Jeff Jarrett versus Rhino with Tito Ortiz as the referee. So not the best pay-per-view. Then we have Final Resolution 2006 with the debut of Sting. Got the LAX versus the Naturals versus Team Canada versus Lance Hoyt and Jay Lethal. And Kenny King. We got Alex Shelley, Austin Aries, and Roderick Strong versus Matt Bentley, Chris Sabin, and Sanjay Dutt. You got Ron the Truth Killings versus Bobby Roode. Great match. The James Gang, which is Billy Gunn and Road Dogg versus the Diamonds in the Rough. You got Raven versus X-Pac. Rhino versus Abyss. AJ Styles versus Tanahashi. America's Most Wanted versus the Dudley Boys. Samoa Joe versus Christopher Daniels, which was a great match. And then you got Sting and Christian Cage versus Jeff Jarrett and alpha male Monty Brown, which is a very good match. Alpha Male Monty Brown didn't really do anything in WWE because they didn't really know what to do with him. They repackaged him as Marcus Corvon. So TNA knew how to use him though. Next we have Lockdown 2007. Or 2006, I'm sorry. We've got Conan versus Bullet Bob Armstrong. Oh, not a good one. Got Christopher Daniels versus Senshi. Then you've got Sanjay Dutt, Alex Shelley, and Jay Lethal versus Minoru Tanaka, Black Tiger, and Hiroku Goto. Then, of course, you've got the escape match. Chris Sabin versus Petey Williams versus Elix Skipper versus Chase Stevens versus Shark Boy versus Puma. Got the Dudley Boys versus Team Canada. You got Samoa Joe versus Sabu. Yeah. Then you got the Lethal Lockdown match. You got AJ Styles, Rhino, Ron Killings, and Sting versus Jeff Jarrett, Big Papa Pump, Scott Steiner, and America's Most Wanted. The talent that TNA had and the wasted opportunities, I can see why Eric Bischoff was pissed with the talent on this roster. Christian Cage versus Abyss was a solid match. So, very solid pay-per-view right here. Then we have Bound for Glory. Yep, 2006. So you got the Kevin Nash Open Invitational X Division Gauntlet Battle Royal. I love that that storyline where they put Kevin Nash in pretty much the Cruiserweight division. You've got the Dudley Boys versus America's Most Wanted versus the James Gang versus the Naturals. And then you've got Abyss versus Samoa Joe versus Spike Dudley versus Raven in a Monsters Ball match. Eric Young versus Larry Zbyszko. Larry Zbyszko is still putting on a wrestling match here. Senshi versus Chris Sabin. Solid match. Rhino versus Christian Cage. Not so great. You got AJ Styles and Christopher Daniels tag teaming now versus LAX, which was a great match. Then you got Jeff Jarrett versus Sting, which was always solid. And Kurt Angle as the referee, because this was Kurt Angle's debut. This was a big pay-per-view for TNA. But yet, again, you know, they blew the opportunity. Then we've got Genesis 2006. This was the last TNA pay-per-view I watched. The rest of these after this point, I have not watched yet. We got the Voodoo Kin Mafia, which is Road Dogg and Billy Gunn versus Matt Bentley, Johnny Devine, and Kazarian. Got the Naturals versus Jay Lethal and Sanjay Dutt. You got Christopher Daniels versus Chris Sabin. You got Ron the Truth Killings and Lance Hoyt versus Alex Shelley and Austin Starr. AJ Styles versus Christian Cage was amazing. LAX versus America's Most Wanted. Sting versus the Monster Abyss, which was a good match. Then you got Kurt Angle and Samoa Joe, which was an amazing match. So great pay-per-view right here. Next, we have Turning Point 2006. This is their last pay-per-view of the year from December. You got Senshi versus Austin Starr versus Alex Shelley versus Sanjay Dutt versus Jay Lethal. You got Miss Brooks versus Eric Young in a bikini contest. That has to be funny. You got Christopher Daniels versus Chris Sabin. You got Rhino versus AJ Styles now. LAX versus America's Most Wanted. And then two main events. You got Abyss and Christian Cage versus Sting for the world title in a triple threat. And then you got the rematch, Kurt Angle and Samoa Joe. So this has to be a pretty solid pay-per-view. Comment down below if you've seen it. Then you have Final Resolution 2007. You got Lance Hoyt versus Chase Stevens. Alex Shelley versus Austin Starr. Petey Williams versus Cowboy James Storm. Rhino versus AJ Styles. Boy, that X Division match has got to be good. Christopher Daniels, Jerry Lynn, and Chris Sabin. Got LAX versus the Dudley Boys. And then another double main event. Looks like pretty much the 2 main events from the last pay-per-view. Kurt Angle versus Samoa Joe, this time in an Iron Man match. Then you got Abyss versus Christian Cage versus Sting again. Looks like the debut of Tyson Tomko there as well. So all the talent on this roster, and they never did anything with it. Got Destination X. Yep, you got the 5-way ladder match from Impact for the #1 contender status of the X Championship. Gauntlet for the gold on Impact from where Samoa Joe earns his world title. Those are just bonus matches, not part of the pay-per-view. James Storm and Jacqueline versus Petey Williams and Gail Kim. You got Senshi versus Austin Starr. You got LAX versus the Dudley Boys. Chris Sabin versus Jerry Lynn. And then you got 4 main events pretty much. You got Kurt Angle versus Scott Steiner, which was probably not going to be good. Scott Steiner at this point wasn't doing very well. Sting versus Abyss. Rhino versus AJ Styles, and Christian Cage versus Samoa Joe. I mean, Jesus Christ, the talent on this roster. Then you've got Lockdown. Yep, 2006 still, yep. No, that was 2007. All right, Serotonin versus the Voodoo Kin Mafia. Got the Fallen Angel Christopher Daniels versus Jerry Lynn. Got Petey Williams versus Robert Roode. You got Gail Kim versus Jacqueline. Senshi versus Austin Starr with Mr. Bob Backlund as the referee. Wildcat Chris Harris versus James Storm. Breaking up of America's Most Wanted, basically. X Division escape match. Chris Sabin, Jay Lethal, Sanjay Dutt, Alex Shelley, and Shark Boy. Got LAX versus the Dudleys again. Then in the Lockdown match, you got Kurt Angle, Sting, Samoa Joe, Rhino, and Jeff Jarrett versus Christian Cage, AJ Styles, Scott Steiner, Abyss, and Tomko. That is a lot of big names in one match. So hopefully this would be a good one to watch. Then we've got Slammiversary. This pay-per-view is stacked right here. I remember that reading the back of this one. Got Voodoo Kin Mafia versus Basham and Damaja. That's basically the Basham brothers from WWE. Got Bob Backlund versus Alex Shelley. Rhino and Senshi versus the Latin American Exchange. Eric Young versus Bobby Roode. Frank Wycheck and Jerry Lynn versus Cowboy James Storm and R-Truth. I don't know about that. Frank Wycheck from the NFL, really. Abyss versus Tomko. Sting versus Christopher Daniels, which I'm sure is a great match. Chris Sabin versus Black Machismo Jay Lethal. Team 3D versus Rick Steiner and Animal. This is when Scott Steiner got hurt, I believe. Then you got Christian Cage, Kurt Angle, AJ Styles, Samoa Joe, and Chris Harris in the King of the Mountain match for the TNA World Title. I've never seen a King of the Mountain match, so I really want to check this out for that match in particular. Let me know if it's any good. If you've seen it, comment down below. Then we've got Hard Justice 2007. And this is where, between Kurt Angle and Samoa Joe, they've got every single belt. So that's a little ridiculous. You got Triple X versus the Motor City Machine Guns versus Sanjay Dutt and Jay Lethal. You got Kaz versus Raven. You got Rhino versus Cowboy James Storm. You got the Latin American Exchange versus the Voodoo Kin Mafia. You got Chris Harris versus Goldust, basically. Only his gimmick here is Black Rain. Got Eric Young versus Bobby Roode. Team 3D versus the Steiner brothers. So now Scott Steiner's back here. Adam Pac-Man Jones joins TNA. This is when he got kicked out of the NFL. You got Sting, Abyss, and Test versus Christian Cage, AJ Styles, and Tyson Tomko. So now they even bring in Test here. Then you got Kurt Angle versus Samoa Joe for every single TNA title. But, I mean, the roster's just stacked. Jesus Christ. Then we've got Bound for Glory 2007, which again is pretty much their WrestleMania. Fight for the Right match featuring 15 TNA superstars battling for a shot at the TNA World Heavyweight Championship. Then you've got the Steiner Brothers versus Team 3D. LAX versus Triple X. And then a Knockouts Gauntlet Battle Royal to crown the first TNA Women's Champion. Gail Kim, Christy Hemme, Miss Brooks, Jacqueline, Roxy Laveau, and more. Matt Morgan's the referee, so now Matt Morgan's even here. You got Samoa Joe versus Christian Cage. Then you got Abyss versus Raven versus Rhino versus Goldust. Then you got Jay Lethal versus the Fallen Angel, Christopher Daniels. I'm sure that's a good match. Team Pac-Man versus AJ Styles and Tomko. Oh, I guess they had R-Truth trying to carry Pac-Man. Then you got Kurt Angle versus Sting, which I'm sure is an amazing match. So I'll definitely have to check this one out. Then we have Genesis. You got Samoa Joe versus Bobby Roode. The Motor City Machine Guns versus the Dudley Boys. Abyss versus Goldust. Kaz versus Christian Cage. Gail Kim versus ODB versus Angel Williams versus Rocky Laveau. I only know Gail Kim out of all of them. AJ Styles and Tomko versus the Steiner Brothers. Jay Lethal versus Sanjay Dutt. And then you got Kurt Angle and Kevin Nash versus Sting and Booker T. So now Booker T's even here too. I mean, the influx of people, especially in 2007 here to TNA. Wow. Reminds me of WCW in their prime. Then we've got Turning Point. Got Roxy Laveau and ODB versus Velvet Sky and Angelina Love. You got Eric Young versus Cowboy James Storm. And in a tables match, you got the Motor City Machine Guns and X Division champion Jay Lethal versus the Dudley Boys and Johnny Devine. Feast or Fired, this is another match I kind of want to see. Senshi versus Alex Skipper versus Christopher Daniels versus Sanjay Dutt versus Shark Boy versus Lance Hoyt versus Jimmy Rave versus Petey Williams versus Chris Harris versus BG James versus Kip James versus Homicide versus Hernandez versus Scott Steiner. Don't know how it works, but kind of want to see. Gail Kim versus Awesome Kong. Awesome Kong was Karma in WWE, and I never really saw her wrestle except for in the Royal Rumble itself. 10,000 tax match. Oh boy. Abyss and Raven versus Goldust and Relic, who is Johnny the Bull from WCW. Got Booker T and Kaz versus Christian Cage and Bobby Roode. Then you got the Angle Alliance versus Samoa Joe, Kevin Nash, and Eric Young. So this doesn't look like a great pay-per-view. Then we've got Final Resolution 2008. This is where Christian Cage pretty much takes over Kurt Angle's stable. Got LAX versus Lance Hoyt and Jimmy Rave. Abyss versus Judas Messias. I don't know who that is. Let me comment down below if you know who Judas Messias is. Kaz versus Goldust. Motor City Machine Guns and Black Machismo Jay Lethal versus Team 3D and Johnny Devine. Got Booker T and Sharmell versus Bobby Roode and Miss Brooks. Gail Kim versus Awesome Kong again. AJ Styles and Tomko versus Samoa Joe and Kevin Nash. And then you got Kurt Angle versus Christian Cage. This one looks better than the last one. Then we've got Against All Odds. I got Tracy Brooks versus Peyton Banks. Eric Young versus Cowboy James Storm in a drinking championship match. That should be weird. Scott Steiner versus Petey Williams. This is that should be interesting. Got Booker T versus Bobby Roode. You got Jay Lethal versus the Motor City Machine Guns versus Team 3D and Johnny Devine. Awesome Kong and ODB. AJ Styles and Tomko versus BG James and Bullet Bob Armstrong. Ouch. Then you got Abyss versus Judas Messias again. Then you got Kurt Angle versus Christian Cage, which I'm sure is going to be a good match. This one doesn't look very good. Then we've got Destination X. Got the Angle Alliance versus Samoa Joe and Christian Cage and Kevin Nash. Got Rhino versus Cowboy James Storm. Another match I'd like to see is that Elevation X match. Jay Lethal versus Petey Williams. Awesome Kong versus Gail Kim versus ODB. You got the Motor City Machine Guns versus the Latin American Exchange versus the Rock and Rave Infection. Booker T and Bobby Roode. They seem to be doing a lot of rematches, all these pay-per-views. Kaz and Eric Young versus Goldust and Relic. Team 3D versus Shark Boy and Curry Man. So this one doesn't look too good. Then finally we have Lockdown 2008. This was the last TNA pay-per-view I bought on DVD. Got Angelina Love versus Velvet Sky versus Salinas versus Raka Khan versus Tracy Brooks versus Christy Hemme versus Jacqueline versus Roxy Laveau. Got Awesome Kong and Rashida Seed versus Gail Kim and ODB. So they did have a lot of women wrestlers in TNA at this point. They were kind of pushing the barriers for women at this point for wrestling. Got Booker T and Sharmell versus Bobby Roode and Peyton Banks. Another rematch again. I think this is the third pay-per-view in a row. You got Billy Gunn and Road Dogg. You got the Latin American Exchange versus the Motor City Machine Guns versus the Rock and Rave Infection versus Scott Steiner and Petey Williams versus Kaz and Eric Young versus Black Rain and Relic cuffed to the cage. I don't know what that is. Comment down below if you know what that is. Then you got Jay Lethal versus Curry Man versus Sanjay Dutt versus Shark Boy versus Johnny Devine versus Consequences Creed, which is Xavier Woods. Got the Lethal Lockdown match, which is Christian Cage, Sting, Rhino, Kevin Nash, and Matt Morgan versus Team Tomko, which is Tomko, AJ Styles, the Dudley Boys, and Cowboy James Storm. Boy, this roster's stacked. Kurt Angle versus Samoa Joe for the TNA World Title. So this looks like it's got some promise. But that does it for this video. If you like content like this, please like and subscribe. Your support is much appreciated. I am also on Letterboxd. The link is over in the profile of this page. Otherwise, until next time, guys, have a good one.